This is what it would have looked like. At least, I don't know, sort of. Because what we know of Kapil Dev's incredible innings against Zimbabwe in the 1983 World Cup is that there were a lot of rhododendrons there. Flowers. The purple ones. But while we know what the ground looked like, we don't actually know what the innings looked like. And that's because we don't have any footage of that game. And there's two reasons. In 1983, no one in cricket thought India-Zimbabwe was a game that was important enough to actually be broadcast. On the same day West Indies were playing Australia, that was a much bigger draw at that time. And usually there would have been a couple of news cameras there to at least get some shots. But there was a strike at the BBC. So all we are left with is rhododendron-coloured dreams of perhaps the greatest World Cup innings that was ever played.
As Rawson comes into Kapil Dev, who has 99. This one nudged out in the offside to get through for the single. And he's got it. And there's going to be applause from all the Zimbabwe players. And never mind all the Indian supporters here.
The first thing you need to know is that although the match was against Zimbabwe, they were actually quite a handy side in that tournament. In fact, they'd done very well in a game against Australia. They had fought their way to 240, and they had two bowlers that gave Australia a lot of issues. The off-spinner John Tracos and the in-swing bowler Vince Hogg. And the reason for this is because Australia just had a bunch of left-handers, and Zimbabwe completely strangled their scoring. Graham Wood made 31 off 60, David Hookes 20 from 48, Alan Border 17 from 33, and only Kepler Wessels went deep. But he was still slow. So at 176 for 7, Australia needs 64 runs off 64 balls. And that's when Rod Marsh, the wicketkeeper, launched a counter-attack. He made his 50 off 42 balls, but he couldn't win the game. Zimbabwe beat Australia in that World Cup. And it wasn't even the only surprising underdog victory in that group, because coming into that World Cup, the West Indies had never lost a World Cup match. And this was arguably maybe their strongest team. Michael Holding, Andy Roberts, Malcolm Marshall and Joel Garner were their seamers. And it got worse for India because the match was delayed because it was a bit of a damp wicket. But none of that bothered Yashpal Sharma. He made 89. No one else passed 40. But it meant that India would end up with 262 from their 60 overs, which was their highest total in a World Cup so far. And it would be Sharma who made runs again in the semi-final. In fact, he only played 2 innings in that tournament where he passed 50, but both of them made a huge mark. And he very nearly batted West Indies out of the game. In fact, they were 157 for 9 before Andy Roberts and Joel Garner put on a 71-run final wicket partnership to drag themselves towards the total. But India still got over the line. So that meant that when India and Zimbabwe were playing each other in this game, they had both beaten the two most favoured sides. And so they took that confidence with them as they travelled south from London down to the Neville Ground in Tunbridge Wells. A club venue really, and an occasional outground for Kent. It's the sort of place that would get 2 first-class games a year, but was absolutely beautiful, and everyone always talked about the rhododendron. Of course, not that there are any video cameras there to catch it. When the game started, that was probably a plus for India, because it was horrendous. They fell to 17 for 5 by the time Kapil Dev came in, and he recovered them a little bit, and then they were 78 for 7. This clearly wasn't going to be enough runs against a very disciplined Zimbabwean team. Now, it was important to note that this was not a knockout. At this point, all teams in their group had played 4 matches. The West Indies had 3 wins and were pretty safe. Australia and India were tied on 2 wins each, but Australia had the better run rate. Not net run rate, because that didn't actually exist at the time. But with Australia playing the West Indies at the same time and India going up against Zimbabwe, a win would have put a lot more pressure on the Aussies, plus it was a chance for them to actually get a run rate boost. So being dismissed before lunch, and they took lunch early, they didn't even wait to the end of the innings, but there was a chance that India would not even bat to the first lunch break of the day. That was certainly not part of the plan. And it also meant that even if the Australians lost to the West Indies, India, Zimbabwe and Australia would all be on 2 wins with a game to go. At best, losing this match means that they would have to beat Australia in what was essentially a knockout in the next round. And that is if the Aussies lost to the West Indies. I won't go into the full points table because it's a little bit confusing. But while everything I've just said is true, all India really knew is they had to win this game. And it just did not look likely. But Kapil Dev was still there. And he had 2 advantages. Zimbabwe had actually used all their best seamers already, and there was a small boundary on one side of the ground. Kapil Dev wasn't slogging, but playing correct shots, but just hitting them very, very hard. And he did this for an incredibly long time. India made it past 100 runs and the early scheduled lunch break, and then on to 200. And I can't show you any of the footage, but I can show you this, his strike rate, and then the strike rate of the rest of the batters on his team combined. No one else made more than 35 runs for India, and no one else scored at quicker than a 50 strike rate. Kapil Dev scored at 4 times the rate of his team. His 100 came up off 72 balls. The rest of the team added 79 runs for their 8 wickets. That score was a world record and something that every single person in India would have wanted to see. In fact, every cricket fan really. But no one would. The ground was small, the crowd the same, and all we got was a few photos. And to be fair, Zimbabwe just didn't give up after Kapil Dev did all that batting. Kevin Carver, the father of Sam and Tom, scored a 50 to almost start to sway the game back for Zimbabwe. But when he fell, they were gone. And guess who took the last wicket as a caught and bowled? Yep, Kapil Dev. Now you can imagine the kind of impact that this innings had. In fact, even now you will hear people say that Kapil Dev won India the World Cup through this innings. And it's obviously not quite true. For instance, they would go on to beat Australia in the next game, so this result didn't matter as much anyway. And others will say things like it changed how India played their limited overs cricket. But if you remember from earlier, I'd already mentioned that they had a really good score earlier in that tournament. And that was against the West Indies as well. But there's something quite dramatic about the Kapil Dev innings. Not just the fact that he played an absolutely stonking knock. It's the fact that it wasn't seen and India was in so much trouble. And perhaps had they lost that game, they wouldn't have even had the confidence to go on and beat Australia in the next one. But also this game lives on because what Kapil did without many people watching it is a dreamlike innings, right? Your team is in trouble in the World Cup and you hit them out of trouble completely on your own. That is actually what most young cricketers dream of when they go to bed at night. But if India hadn't gone on in this tournament, we wouldn't still be talking about this innings as much. But of course, India did beat Australia in the next game. They then won their semi-final and they made it to the final where they slipped up and they only set 183. Only the dashing Chris Srikanth, one of the first real slappers in ODIs, made it past 30. That bowling lineup I mentioned before, Garner, Roberts, Marshall and Holding, was simply too good for the Indian batters. And only Garner actually bowled out his overs. It was pretty clear that the West Indies team, who had only lost 1 game in World Cup history at this point, was going to win this game without any real trouble. Gordon Greenidge and Desmond Haynes were opening up for the West Indies, and Greenidge had made more runs than this at Lords on his own in a 4th innings in a test with only 1 leg. But not this time, and he was out early. Haynes would finish his career with 17 ODI centuries, and one of those was 152 not out. He was an absolute champion early ODI anchor, but he was out too. But as good as that pair was, Viv Richards was something else entirely. If you dropped his average and strike rate into modern cricket, he'd still be one of the best players in the world now. His current numbers are almost identical to those of Rohit Sharma. Viv Richards scored quicker than anyone else of his era and did so while averaging almost 50. And he was the second leading scorer in this tournament as well, and he had already made 100 against India. His reputation was almost enough to do the chasing on its own. So when Maiden Lal comes in and bowls the short ball and he mishits it, India don't just have a chance, they have a lifeline. And from that moment onwards, India's medium-paced militia were all over the West Indies. And realistically, they never even got close to winning that game. India won by 43 runs. But I just want to put this into context for a moment. India did not win a game in the 1979 tournament. And 4 years later, they were holding the trophy. And there's something really interesting that I haven't mentioned yet. When Viv Richards makes contact with the pull shot, you hear a commentator, shot. When he makes contact with this ball, you can hear the commentator say something very quickly. I'm pretty sure that's Richie Benaud, and he says, shot. Because that is what is supposed to happen. When a slow seamer bowls short to Viv Richards, he absolutely destroys them. That is why the camera actually moves out to the boundary. So you can actually barely see Kapil Dev turn at mid-wicket, take 18 steps, running at near full pace, looking back over his shoulder, and easily take this catch. And let's be honest, Kapil Dev's innings was not as important as remembered. And Kapil Dev's catch was not as magnificent as memory makes it feel. But what India did as a team, in beating the best ODI team in the world, stopping their three-peat, and winning the World Cup for themselves, changed cricket forever. And India might have developed the way it has in cricket anyway. There was certainly already a mad passion for the game. But winning that World Cup in 1983 took a love and made it obsession. But this is not one of the great catches of cricket. Kapil Dev didn't do anything special from an athletic or fielding perspective here. Even in that era of cricket, you would have expected quite a few players to be able to take this. But this is the catch that changed cricket. And we could see it and feel it. The innings against Zimbabwe was locked away in a pretty rural ground surrounded by flowers. And we just kind of have to make the rest of it up. Everything in Indian cricket is recorded. dissected, and opined on. And part of that is because of what Kapil did in this tournament. So there's something romantic about the fact that when India won the World Cup in 1983, instead of looking just at the footage of those shots, what we actually get is a walk in the flowers that only lives in our own imagination.